Today, we are gathered to talk about a challenge that almost every one of us faces in some form. Anxiety. Anxiety can creep into our lives quietly, sometimes triggered by expectations, uncertainty, or the fear of not being enough. It steals our peace, clouds our judgment, and robs us of the simple joy of living in the moment. But here's the truth: anxiety doesn't have to be the director of your life story. You can take back the pen, rewrite the narrative, and begin a journey toward living a truly happy life. The first step in this journey is embracing vulnerability as a strength. Too often, we see vulnerability as weakness, something to hide or suppress. Yet vulnerability is the birthplace of courage, creativity, and meaningful connection. When you allow yourself to be imperfect, when you accept that you don't have to have all the answers or meet every expectation, you begin to release the grip of anxiety. Vulnerability teaches us that we don't need to fight against our fears. Instead, we can walk alongside them and still move forward. Next, we must learn to understand and manage the shame and fear that often fuel anxiety. Shame whispers that we're not good enough, not smart enough, not lovable enough. Fear amplifies those whispers into roars that paralyze us. But the moment we shine light on those voices, naming them for what they are, they begin to lose power. You cannot conquer what you refuse to acknowledge. By recognizing shame and fear as human experiences, not personal failings, we can step into freedom. Remember, you are not your anxious thoughts, you are the observer of them. A powerful tool in quieting anxiety is the practice of self-compassion. Too many of us are kind to everyone else, yet cruel to ourselves. When mistakes happen, when we stumble, we speak words to ourselves we would never dare say to a loved one. Self-compassion changes that inner dialogue. It allows you to treat yourself with gentleness and patience, as you would a dear friend. Anxiety loses its edge when we stop battling ourselves and instead learn to rest in our own worthiness. Another key practice is cultivating gratitude and presence. Anxiety often drags us into the future, filling us with what-ifs. Gratitude roots us in the present. When you pause to notice the beauty around you, the small victories, the moments of joy hidden in ordinary life, you shift your mind from scarcity to abundance. Gratitude is not ignoring pain. It is choosing to notice that joy exists alongside it. Living with gratitude rewires our hearts and teaches us that happiness is not a destination but a way of being. Finally, we need courageous connections with others. Anxiety thrives in isolation, but weakens in connection. When we allow ourselves to be seen, when we reach out and share our stories, when we open our hearts to true belonging, we find relief and healing. Community doesn't erase anxiety, but it reminds us that we don't have to carry it alone. Real happiness grows in the soil of authentic relationships, where we can be loved not for our masks, but for our true selves. So, how do we deal with anxiety and start living a happy life? We lean into vulnerability, recognize and release shame and fear, practice self-compassion, embrace gratitude, and nurture deep connections. Happiness is not the absence of anxiety, it is the presence of courage, compassion, and connection despite it. My friends, life is too precious to be lived under the weight of anxiety. Choose to show up bravely, to love yourself fully, and to walk forward with hope. When you do, happiness will no longer be something you chase. It will be something you live. Embracing vulnerability as strength is perhaps one of the most misunderstood yet transformative ways of dealing with anxiety and beginning to live a happy life. The word vulnerability often makes people uncomfortable because it has long been associated with weakness, fragility, or the potential to be hurt. From a young age, we are taught to hide our vulnerabilities, to put on a brave face, to appear strong even when we are crumbling inside. Yet this constant armor we wear becomes one of the very things that fuels anxiety. Anxiety thrives when we feel like we have to be perfect, when we believe we cannot show our struggles, when we convince ourselves that no one can ever see our fears, our doubts, or our imperfections. The truth is that the more we try to hide our vulnerabilities, the more power they gain over us. But when we learn to embrace them, to acknowledge them openly, and even to share them with trusted people, something powerful begins to happen. Anxiety loosens its grip, and we make space for joy and authenticity. Think about how much energy it takes to constantly pretend to be fine when you are not. How much mental and emotional labor goes into smiling when inside you are panicked, saying yes when you desperately want to say no, or forcing yourself to be strong when what you really need is comfort. That performance becomes exhausting. It drains your spirit and leaves you anxious about being found out. But the moment you allow yourself to be vulnerable, you give yourself permission to put down that heavy mask. You stop running from the fear of being seen as weak, and instead begin to live in the freedom of being human. Vulnerability does not mean you break down in front of everyone or expose your deepest secrets to strangers. It means allowing yourself to be real, authentic, and honest. It means accepting that you don't have to have everything figured out, that you don't need to be flawless, and that it's okay to need help. When you embrace vulnerability, you create an inner environment where anxiety cannot thrive as easily. Anxiety feeds off the idea that you must always be in control, that you must always appear capable, that you can never let anyone see you sweat. Vulnerability challenges this by saying it's okay to be uncertain. It's okay to not know the future, and it's okay to stumble. For example, when you admit to a friend that you are nervous before a big presentation, you open the door for empathy and support. Instead of bottling up the worry until it consumes you, you release it. This act of sharing reduces its weight. When you tell yourself, "I am scared right now, but that does not make me weak. It makes me human," you strip away the shame that often intensifies anxiety. Vulnerability allows you to speak truth into the silence where fear grows unchecked. Another important aspect of vulnerability is that it invites connection. Human beings are wired for connection, but connection is impossible without openness. If you present a polished, invulnerable version of yourself to the world, people may admire you, but they cannot truly connect with you. True belonging happens when we are seen and loved for who we are, not for who we pretend to be. That means allowing people to see your flaws, your struggles, and your anxieties. When you risk that kind of openness, you also open yourself up to love, empathy, and support. And support is a powerful antidote to anxiety. The moment you realize you are not alone, that others struggle too, that you don't have to carry the weight all by yourself, something inside you softens. Vulnerability builds bridges that perfectionism and fear would otherwise destroy. Consider the courage it takes to be vulnerable. To say, "I need help," or "I'm afraid," requires far more strength than to hide behind a false smile. Courage is not about never feeling fear. Courage is about showing up even when fear is present. Vulnerability is the path to courage because it demands that you face uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure without knowing the outcome. It asks you to stand in your truth without the guarantee of how others will respond. And yet, in that very risk lies freedom. Once you accept that you cannot control everything, once you release the exhausting need to be perfect, you find a deeper peace. That peace is the foundation of happiness. Embracing vulnerability also transforms the way you respond to failure. Anxiety often stems from the terror of failing to meet expectations, failing to succeed, failing to be accepted. When you are unwilling to be vulnerable, failure feels like proof that you are not enough. But when you embrace vulnerability, failure becomes part of the journey. You begin to see mistakes not as shameful, but as opportunities for growth. You realize that failure is not a definition of who you are, but simply an experience you go through. Vulnerability allows you to pick yourself up after setbacks without drowning in self-blame. because you no longer tie your worth to flawless performance. Instead, you tie it to the courage of showing up. This mindset dramatically reduces the anxiety surrounding failure and frees you to pursue your goals with more joy. Living vulnerably also means being open to joy, which may sound surprising. Many people think of vulnerability only in terms of pain or weakness. But joy requires vulnerability too. Why? Because to fully feel joy, you have to let go of the fear that it might be taken away. Anxiety often whispers, "Don't get too happy. It won't last." Vulnerability counters that by saying, "I will allow myself to experience this joy fully, even though I know life is uncertain." Vulnerability opens the heart, not just to sorrow, but to love, laughter, gratitude, and wonder. Without it, we keep ourselves numb. But numbing anxiety also numbs happiness. Vulnerability keeps us alive to the full spectrum of human emotion. It is important to remember that vulnerability is not reckless exposure. It is not about sharing everything with everyone. It is about discernment. Choosing who has earned the right to hear your story. Choosing the spaces where your openness will be honored. Practicing vulnerability with care ensures that it strengthens you instead of harming you. But once you learn how to let trusted people into your struggles, anxiety loses its ability to keep you isolated. Isolation feeds fear, but connection nourishes resilience. Ultimately, embracing vulnerability is about living authentically. It is about rejecting the false belief that you must hide the messy parts of your life to be accepted. Authenticity says, "This is me, imperfect and still worthy of love." And in that authenticity, happiness flourishes. Because happiness is not found in perfection but in freedom. The freedom to be yourself without apology, without armor, without constant performance. Vulnerability gives you that freedom. It transforms anxiety from a prison into a teacher, from something that crushes you into something that shapes you. It allows you to move through life, not as someone who has it all together, but as someone brave enough to show up exactly as you are. And that is where true joy begins. Shame and fear are at the very heart of anxiety. And unless we learn how to understand and manage them, we remain trapped in a cycle of worry, self-doubt, and disconnection. Shame whispers that we are unworthy, that something is wrong with us, that we don't measure up to others. Fear then magnifies those whispers, turning them into paralyzing thoughts that keep us stuck. Together, shame and fear are powerful drivers of anxiety, often dictating our actions, decisions, and even how we see ourselves. But the truth is, these emotions, while deeply uncomfortable, can be understood and managed. Once we shine light on them instead of hiding from them, they lose their power, and we begin to reclaim peace and happiness. Shame is one of the most universal yet most silenced emotions we carry. Everyone experiences shame, but very few want to talk about it. Why? Because shame itself convinces us that speaking of it will only confirm its truth. It tells us that if we admit we feel inadequate, unworthy, or flawed, people will reject us. And so, we keep it hidden, and in that secrecy, shame grows louder. Anxiety often sprouts from this hidden shame. The dread of not being good enough at work, in relationships, as parents, or as human beings. Every time you compare yourself to others and come up short, every time you replay past mistakes and label yourself a failure, every time you silence your voice for fear of judgment, shame is quietly at work. The first step in managing shame is to recognize its presence and call it what it is. Shame thrives in silence and secrecy, but it cannot survive being spoken aloud and acknowledged. Fear, on the other hand, is a natural response designed to protect us from danger. In its pure form, it is not our enemy. It alerts us to threats and prepares us to act. But when fear becomes chronic, when it attaches itself to situations that do not truly endanger us, it turns into anxiety. Fear tells us stories about what could go wrong, what people might think, how we might fail. It paralyzes us before we even take a step. And because fear often walks hand in hand with shame, It convinces us that failure is not just an event, but proof of our inadequacy. This is why fear feels so heavy. It is rarely about the external risk and more about the internal belief that we will not be enough if things go wrong. To manage shame and fear, we must first change our relationship with them. Instead of letting them define us, we can learn to see them as visitors, as emotions that pass through but do not have to control us. When shame arises, rather than immediately believing the story it tells, I am not worthy. I am broken. I am unlovable. We can pause and separate who we are from what we feel. You are not shame. You are a human being experiencing the emotion of shame. Likewise, when fear starts spinning its endless scenarios, you will fail. They will laugh. You're not ready. We can recognize that fear is a voice, not the absolute truth. The act of naming these emotions already weakens them. Saying, this is shame, or this is fear, creates distance. And in that distance lies freedom. One of the most powerful ways to dismantle shame is through empathy. When you share your struggles with someone who responds with understanding and compassion, shame cannot survive. The moment you realize that others have felt the same way, that you are not alone, the isolating grip of shame loosens. This is why courageous conversations matter. Speaking the words that shame tells you never to say. Fear says, keep quiet or you'll be judged. But courage says, tell the truth and you will be free. By opening up to trusted people, we take away the secrecy that gives shame its strength. And by practicing empathy toward others, we create safe spaces where their shame cannot thrive either. Managing fear, on the other hand, often requires facing it instead of avoiding it. Fear grows larger when we run from it, but when we take small steps toward it, it begins to shrink. For example, if fear tells you not to speak up in a meeting because you might sound foolish, the act of speaking, even if imperfectly, begins to challenge fear's narrative. Each time you confront fear with action, you prove to yourself that you are stronger than the stories it spins. Fear may never disappear completely, but it becomes a companion you can walk with rather than a master you must obey. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to move forward despite it. It is also important to understand that shame and fear are often inherited voices, shaped by our culture, upbringing, and past experiences. Many of the not enough messages we carry are not truths but echoes of criticism, unrealistic expectations, or societal pressures. Recognizing where those voices come from allows us to challenge them. Ask yourself, whose voice is this really? Is it the voice of my parents' expectations, my culture's standards, a teacher's criticism, or the comparison I make with someone online? By tracing shame and fear back to their roots, we can see that they are not absolute truths about us, but learned narratives we have the power to rewrite. Self-compassion is another essential tool in managing these emotions. Shame and fear thrive in self-criticism, but weaken in kindness. When you respond to your struggles with the same gentleness you would offer a loved one, shame no longer has fuel. Imagine a friend coming to you and saying, I feel like I am not enough. Would you attack them, belittle them, and agree with their shame? Of course not. You would comfort them, remind them of their worth, and encourage them. Learning to do this for yourself changes everything. When shame whispers that you are not enough, answer with compassion, I am imperfect, but I am worthy of love. When fear warns you that you might fail, answer with gentleness, even if I stumble, I will still be valuable. The shame and fear may never vanish from our lives entirely, but they can be managed so that they no longer rule us. The key is not to eliminate them, but to transform our relationship with them. By naming them, sharing them, facing them, and answering them with compassion, we strip away their power. In that process, anxiety begins to lose its foundation. What once felt like an overwhelming storm becomes a passing cloud. And in the space that opens up, happiness begins to take root. Living a happy life is not about never feeling shame or fear again. It is about refusing to let them dictate the course of your life. It is about recognizing that you are far more than the stories they tell. You are not your failures, your doubts, or your insecurities. You are a human being capable of courage, growth, love, and joy. When you learn to manage shame and fear, you reclaim that truth. Anxiety no longer defines your days, and happiness becomes something you live, not something you chase. One of the most powerful yet overlooked ways to deal with anxiety and to step into a happier life is by practicing self-compassion daily. Anxiety often thrives in the harsh environment of self-criticism. When we make a mistake, stumble, or feel fear, our first instinct is often to attack ourselves with blame, shame, and harsh judgment. We tell ourselves we are weak, that we are not trying hard enough, that we are somehow broken for feeling anxious in the first place. But the truth is that this inner cruelty only deepens anxiety, feeding it with a constant cycle of negativity. What truly heals, what truly softens the edge of anxiety, is the daily practice of treating ourselves with kindness, patience, and compassion. Self-compassion is not a luxury. It is a necessity for anyone who wants to find peace and happiness while walking through the struggles of life. Self-compassion begins with a simple but radical idea: that you deserve to treat yourself with the same warmth and care you so easily extend to others. Think about how you comfort a friend who is anxious or in pain. You do not tell them they are worthless or weak. You do not remind them of every mistake they've made. Instead, you reassure them. You remind them of their worth. You offer them love and patience. Yet when it comes to ourselves, we often withhold that same grace. We speak to ourselves with a voice that we would never use on someone we love. This voice becomes the loudspeaker of anxiety. It convinces us that we are failing, that we are not enough, that something is wrong with us. But the moment we shift our inner dialogue to one of compassion, everything begins to change. Anxiety loses its fuel when we stop feeding it with cruelty. Practicing self-compassion daily means creating a new habit of noticing how we speak to ourselves. Instead of automatically launching into self-blame when things go wrong, we pause and ask, what would I say to a loved one in this situation? And then offer those words to ourselves. For example, if you freeze during a presentation and your anxious mind screams, "You're such a failure," self-compassion answers with, "That was tough. But it doesn't define me. Everyone struggles sometimes. I can try again." This shift in language may seem small, but over time it rewires the way we relate to ourselves. It teaches us to see ourselves not as enemies to be punished, but as humans to be supported. Daily self-compassion also requires embracing imperfection. Anxiety often stems from the demand to be flawless, to never make mistakes, to always be in control. But perfection is an impossible standard, and chasing it only leads to exhaustion. Self-compassion invites us to release that burden. It reminds us that to be human is to be imperfect, and that imperfection does not cancel out worthiness. When we stumble, when we fall short, self-compassion does not say, "You're broken." It says, "This is part of being human, and you are still worthy of love." This perspective transforms failure from a source of shame into an opportunity for growth. Instead of being trapped in the anxiety of, "I must not fail," we learn to live with the gentler truth of, "Even if I fail, I am still enough." Another aspect of self-compassion is mindfulness. Anxiety often pulls us into spirals of judgment and overthinking. We get lost in thoughts of what we should have done differently, what might go wrong, how we might embarrass ourselves in the future. Self-compassion asks us to step into mindfulness, to simply notice our suffering without amplifying it with judgment. Mindfulness is not about pushing anxiety away, but about observing it with curiosity instead of criticism. When you feel anxious, instead of saying, "I shouldn't feel this way, I'm so weak," you say, I am anxious right now, and that's okay. This is a human emotion. That shift, accepting rather than condemning your feelings, is a profound act of compassion. It allows anxiety to pass more smoothly because you are not fighting it with resistance. The daily practice of self-compassion also means intentionally creating rituals of kindness toward yourself. It could be as simple as starting your morning with affirmations like, "I am doing my best today, and that is enough." It could be pausing in moments of stress to place a hand on your heart and remind yourself, "I am safe, I am loved, I am worthy." It could be allowing yourself to rest without guilt when you are exhausted, rather than pushing through in the name of productivity. It could even be treating your body kindly, choosing nourishing foods, moving in ways that feel good, sleeping enough, because you see yourself as deserving of care. These small daily acts of compassion accumulate into a larger sense of peace and self-acceptance. It's important to remember that self-compassion is not about self-indulgence or ignoring responsibility. Some people resist the idea of being kind to themselves because they fear it will make them lazy or complacent. But the opposite is true. Research and experience show that people who practice self-compassion are actually more resilient, more motivated, and more willing to try again after setbacks. Why? Because when failure is not tied to your worth, you are free to take risks, to grow, to learn. When anxiety no longer convinces you that mistakes make you unworthy, you can face challenges with courage. Self-compassion strengthens. It does not weaken. It gives you the stability to move forward with greater confidence. Practicing self-compassion daily also means forgiving yourself for past mistakes. Anxiety often feeds on the ghosts of our past, replaying moments when we fell short or made poor choices. Without compassion, we relive these memories with shame and regret, chaining ourselves to them. But forgiveness, genuine self-forgiveness, is an act of compassion that releases those chains. It acknowledges the mistake, learns from it, and then lets it go. It says, "Yes, I made that choice and I regret it, but I am more than that mistake. I am worthy of moving forward." This forgiveness quiets the anxious voice that insists you are defined by your past. It replaces it with a gentler truth: you are defined by your ability to grow, to love, to try again. In practicing daily self-compassion, you also cultivate resilience. Life will always bring challenges, uncertainties, and moments of fear. Anxiety tries to convince us that these challenges are proof we cannot cope. But self-compassion reminds us that struggle does not diminish us. It is precisely in moments of struggle that compassion becomes most powerful. When you can meet your own suffering with gentleness, you build an inner strength that no external circumstance can easily shake. You learn that you can survive the storms because you are not fighting yourself in the process. You become your own ally rather than your harshest critic. That alliance is the foundation of a truly happy life. Ultimately, daily self-compassion is a practice of choosing love over judgment, patience over punishment, acceptance over shame. It is waking up each day and deciding to be on your own side. It is remembering that you do not need to earn your worthiness. It is already yours. The more you practice this, the more you will see anxiety lose its grip. Instead of being a battlefield where you are constantly at war with yourself, your inner world becomes a place of safety, a home where you can rest and breathe. And when your inner world is kind, your outer world begins to feel lighter too. Happiness, then, is no longer something you wait for in the future. It becomes something you create each day by the way you choose to treat yourself. Cultivating gratitude and presence is one of the most transformative ways to break free from the grip of anxiety and to begin truly living a happy life. Anxiety is almost always about leaving the present moment. It either pulls us backward into the past, replaying old mistakes and regrets, or it pushes us forward into the future, spinning endless what-if scenarios of everything that might go wrong. The mind races between these two extremes, and in the process, it robs us of the one place where peace and joy actually exist, the present moment. Gratitude and presence anchor us back to that place. They remind us that right here, right now, life is happening, and within this moment there is something to appreciate, something to hold on to, something to be grateful for. When we speak of gratitude, many people think of it as simply saying thank you for big things, a promotion, a gift, a celebration. But true gratitude is much deeper than that. Gratitude is a way of seeing life, a practice of shifting your focus from what is missing to what is already here. It is about training your mind to notice the ordinary miracles that exist in every day, the warmth of the sun on your skin, the sound of laughter, the comfort of a meal, the kindness of a stranger, the simple fact that you are still here, breathing, with another chance to begin again. Anxiety thrives on scarcity, on convincing you that you don't have enough, that you aren't enough, that something is always lacking. Gratitude answers with abundance. It says, look, there is beauty here. Look, there is goodness here. Look, there is enough here. When you practice gratitude daily, you begin to rewire your brain away from fear and toward peace. Presence works hand in hand with gratitude. To be present means to fully inhabit the moment you are in, rather than rushing past it or dwelling somewhere else. Think of how often we go through our days without actually being in them. We eat meals while scrolling through our phones, barely tasting the food. We talk to loved ones while our minds are already planning tomorrow's tasks. We sit in nature while worrying about emails we haven't answered. Our bodies are here, but our minds are elsewhere. And in that constant distraction, anxiety thrives, because the mind is always chasing or fleeing instead of resting. Cultivating presence means bringing the mind back to this moment, again and again, gently but firmly. It means noticing your breath, listening fully to a friend's voice, savoring a sip of water, feeling your feet on the ground. It means reminding yourself that right now, in this exact second, you are safe, you are here, you are alive. That simple awareness is often enough to loosen anxiety's grip. Gratitude and presence also change the way we experience challenges. Anxiety tells us that hard times are unbearable, that we cannot survive them, that they prove life is unfair. But gratitude says, even here, there is something to hold on to. It does not deny pain, but it insists that joy can coexist with struggle. For example, in the middle of heartbreak, gratitude might remind you of the friends who check in on you, or the lessons you've learned about resilience. In the midst of financial stress, gratitude might bring your attention to the roof over your head, the strength in your body, or the creativity that rises when resources are limited. This is not about pretending that difficulties don't exist. It is about refusing to let them blind you to the goodness that still does. Gratitude shifts the narrative from despair to hope. It whispers that even in the storm, there are anchors. And presence allows you to take life one moment at a time, instead of drowning in the vastness of all possible futures. The practice of gratitude can be as simple as keeping a journal, writing down 3 things each day that you are thankful for. At first, it may feel repetitive or small. You might list things like, I'm grateful for my morning coffee, for my child's smile, for a good night's sleep. But over time, this practice trains your brain to look for the good automatically. Instead of waking up with anxiety as your first thought, your mind begins to search for gratitude. Gratitude journals, gratitude walks, even simply pausing before bed to whisper thanks. All of these small practices build a habit of appreciation that directly weakens anxiety. And the more you notice the good, the more joy you feel, even in ordinary days. Presence can be cultivated through mindfulness practices such as meditation, breathing exercises, or simply pausing during the day to ask yourself, where am I right now? What can I see, hear, feel? These practices bring you back to your senses, back to reality, away from the endless chatter of the anxious mind. Sometimes presence can be as easy as stopping to take 5 slow breaths, feeling the air enter and leave your lungs, noticing the rise and fall of your chest. Anxiety cannot live in the same space as true presence because anxiety is always about somewhere else, what already happened or what might happen. But presence is about now, and now is where peace lives. Gratitude and presence also strengthen relationships, which in turn reduces anxiety. When you are present with someone, truly listening to them, truly seeing them, you build trust and intimacy. When you express gratitude for someone, letting them know you appreciate their role in your life, you deepen the bond between you. These connections are powerful sources of comfort and resilience when anxiety strikes. Gratitude makes you realize you are not alone, and presence ensures that you don't miss the joy of those connections because you are too distracted or worried. Love grows in gratitude, and peace grows in presence. Another beautiful thing about gratitude and presence is that they turn ordinary moments into extraordinary ones. Without them, life passes by in a blur, and anxiety fills the gaps with constant noise. With them, even simple acts, drinking tea, watching the sunset, hearing a song, become moments of joy. Happiness stops being something you chase in the future and becomes something you experience here and now. Gratitude teaches you that you don't need a perfect life to feel joy. You only need to notice the blessings already around you. Presence teaches you that you don't need to have the future figured out to feel peace. You only need to rest in this moment. In truth, cultivating gratitude and presence is not about denying anxiety, but about choosing where to place your attention. Anxiety says, focus on what might go wrong. Gratitude says, look at what is already right. Anxiety says, you are not safe because the future is uncertain. Presence says, you are safe right now, in this breath. These shifts may not silence anxiety completely, but they weaken its authority. They remind you that life is not meant to be lived in fear of tomorrow or regret of yesterday. It is meant to be lived now. And when you live now, with a heart full of gratitude and eyes open to presence, happiness ceases to be elusive. It becomes a way of being. So the invitation is simple yet profound. Practice gratitude every day in small ways. Be present in moments that matter and in moments that seem ordinary. Let these practices anchor you in a life that is not ruled by anxiety, but shaped by awareness, appreciation, and joy. Happiness will not be something you wait for in the distance. It will be something you experience right here, right now, in the sacred gift of this very moment. Anxiety thrives in isolation. When we feel anxious, ashamed, or overwhelmed, our natural instinct is often to withdraw, to hide, to keep our struggles private so that no one can see our weaknesses. We fear judgment, rejection, or burdening others with our problems. But this instinct, while understandable, actually feeds anxiety and keeps us trapped. Human beings are wired for connection. We are not meant to carry our burdens alone. Healing, comfort, and courage often come through relationships, through sharing our truth and allowing others to walk alongside us. Building courageous connections with others is therefore one of the most powerful ways to deal with anxiety and to create a happier life. Courageous connections are not about having hundreds of acquaintances or surrounding yourself with people for the sake of company. They are about cultivating relationships that are authentic, safe, and nourishing. They are about showing up as your real self and allowing others to do the same. For many of us, the thought of being truly seen, flaws, fears, and all, feels terrifying. Anxiety tells us that if we reveal too much of ourselves, others will turn away. But in reality, it is through that very vulnerability that deep connection is formed. When we drop the masks and let people see who we really are, we open the door to intimacy, empathy, and belonging. Belonging is not about fitting in, it is about being accepted as you are. Fitting in demands that we change ourselves to match others' expectations, but belonging allows us to be our authentic selves without fear. True belonging only happens when we dare to be vulnerable and share our real struggles, including anxiety. Imagine telling a trusted friend, "I've been feeling really anxious lately," and instead of judgment, you are met with understanding, perhaps even the words, "I know exactly how that feels." In that moment, the burden lightens. Anxiety loses some of its weight because it is no longer carried alone. This is the power of courageous connection. It reminds us that we are not alone, that we are human, and that our struggles do not make us unlovable. They make us relatable. Of course, building these kinds of connections requires courage. It requires taking the risk of being honest, even when it feels safer to hide. It requires choosing to show up authentically, even when you are afraid of being misunderstood. But the alternative, living behind walls of secrecy and fear, leads to loneliness and deeper anxiety. Loneliness is one of the greatest amplifiers of anxiety. When we are alone with our thoughts, worries multiply unchecked. When we share them, however, they often shrink. Speaking our fears aloud has a way of stripping them of some of their power. It allows us to see them in perspective and to hear the reassuring truth from others that we are not defined by our anxieties. Courageous connections also involve listening. To build authentic relationships, we must not only share our truth, but also create space for others to share theirs. When you offer someone the gift of presence, when you listen without judgment, when you say with your actions, "I see you, I hear you, you matter," you are practicing courage and compassion. And in return, you strengthen the bond of connection. Anxiety often tells us we are alone in our struggles, but when we hear others' stories, we realize how universal those struggles are. The simple act of sitting with someone in their pain, without trying to fix it, without minimizing it, can be healing for both people. It is also important to recognize that courageous connections require boundaries. Not everyone is safe to share your deepest struggles with, and not everyone will respond with empathy. That is why discernment matters. You build courageous connections with people who have earned the right to hear your story, people who can hold space without judgment, people who respect your vulnerability. Choosing wisely is not weakness, it is wisdom. But once you find those safe relationships, lean into them. Let them become places of refuge where your anxiety can be spoken, understood, and met with compassion. In building courageous connections, you also begin to dismantle shame. Shame thrives in secrecy, but it cannot survive being spoken aloud and met with empathy. When you share something you thought was too embarrassing, too heavy, or too flawed to be spoken, and someone responds with kindness instead of rejection, shame loses its grip, and with it, anxiety eases. That is why community friendship and support groups can be so powerful. They are spaces where shared vulnerability becomes collective strength. In such spaces, you learn that your worth is not diminished by your struggles. Instead, your willingness to share them often becomes a source of inspiration and comfort for others. Courageous connections are not only about sharing struggles, they are also about sharing joy. Anxiety has a way of convincing us to stay guarded, to hold back from celebrating or fully enjoying life out of fear it will be taken away. But relationships remind us that joy is magnified when shared. Laughing with friends, celebrating milestones with family, enjoying simple moments with loved ones, all of these experiences strengthen resilience against anxiety. Joy is contagious, and being in authentic community allows you to soak in the joy of others, even when you are struggling yourself. It reminds you that life is bigger than your fears, and that happiness is possible even in the midst of challenges. Sometimes courageous connections mean seeking professional help, therapists, counselors, or mentors who can walk with you through anxiety with expertise and compassion. There is no shame in needing guidance. In fact, Asking for help is one of the bravest acts of connection you can take. It acknowledges that you cannot and should not have to do everything alone. Allowing someone to support you in this way can open doors to healing you may not have found otherwise. Courage is not about carrying the heaviest load. It is about knowing when to ask for help and trusting others enough to receive it. When you build courageous connections, you also begin to cultivate a sense of belonging in the larger world. Anxiety often makes us feel small, disconnected, or powerless. But meaningful relationships remind us of our place in a bigger story. They ground us in love, in community, in purpose. They show us that we matter, that we make a difference, that our presence impacts others. This sense of belonging is essential to happiness, because happiness is not just about personal peace. It is about shared joy, shared meaning, shared life. In the end, courageous connections are about choosing love over fear. Fear tells you to hide, to protect yourself, to stay silent. Love tells you to show up, to open your heart, to risk being seen. And while fear may keep you safe from rejection, it also keeps you safe from intimacy, from support, from joy. Love, expressed through courageous connection, may feel risky at times, but it brings with it the very healing and happiness anxiety tries to steal. It reminds you that you are never truly alone, and that together, we are stronger than our fears. So if you want to deal with anxiety and begin living a happy life, dare to build connections that are real, brave, and compassionate. Share your truth, listen deeply to others, lean on your community, and allow yourself to be loved as you are. Courageous connection will not erase anxiety completely, but it will make the load lighter, the journey easier, and the moments brighter. Because in the end, we were never meant to walk this road alone.